Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Simple Ways to Protect Your Metal Parts During Your Shutdown. So I am Kristen. I am a project manager here at ARMOR, and it's my voice that you are going to hear for the next 30 minutes. And my co-host today is Ryan, and Ryan is our industrial sales manager. Now, some of you know who we are, but for some of you, this is going to be a reintroduction to ARMOR. We want to remind you, during these shutdowns, our purpose is to protect your brand, your parts, and most importantly, your reputation. And how we do it? That's what we call our thing, by making clean, safe, and easy rust prevention and rust removal. So the way we're going to break down this webinar today is into 3 different categories. We're first going to talk about what is VCI. And then next, we're going to talk about best practices during a shutdown you might be currently in right now, or a shutdown you might have in the future. And then we're going to talk about our Stock and Ready program and how it can help you. So when we talk about VCI, before we get into the slide, I do want to preface it by saying not all VCI is the same. And the best analogy I can have for you is this. Think about buying a used car. And you go to the seller who's buying it and they say, oh, this car is great and I just put new tires on it. And you think, great. And you drive away in your new car. And then about 7,000 or 8,000 miles later, you think, these treads are shot. And you realize that you just had some generic tires put on. And at that moment, you realize there is a difference between generic tires and maybe Goodrich or Michelin tires. The same is true for VCI. All of us who produce VCI, we use our own formulas and we understand how that works with specific metals in specific ways. But if you need a refresher on what is VCI, take a look at the screen in front of you. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we call a carrier. And in this example, it's craft paper. We impregnate or coat that carrier with vapor corrosion inhibiting nanotechnology, which is a mouthful. So I'll refer to that as VCI. Sometimes I will call it rust prevention, or sometimes I'll call it corrosion management. But the VCI is impregnated or coated into the carrier, and then you have either armor wrap, or if we look at the next slide, you have what we call armor poly. So it's same idea. The poly is the carrier that's extruded with ARMOR's VCI. You take your metal part, you put that into the armor poly, and you have a protective barrier that's clean, safe, and easy on your metal part. Now, what do I mean by a protective barrier? You first have to imagine taking your metal part and putting it into the VCI bag. And then think of those white dots on your screen as the VCI coming out of that carrier and providing a barrier on that metal part to keep it from rusting. But that barrier is only, if you look at the left-hand side of your screen, 4 to 6 nanometers thick. If you look at the right-hand side, you can compare that to a piece of paper that is 100,000 nanometers thick. So that's how small that barrier is. So VCI is nanotechnology. So now that you know a little bit about VCI and a little reminder of who we are, we're going to break down today's webinar into 4 VCI best practices within each of these areas for a shutdown. We're going to talk about VCI best practices with parts. We're going to talk about VCI best practices with packaging and shipping area, with then packaging material. And then because of the situation that we're in right now with shutdowns, we're not going to talk too much today about destinations. But when we get to that slide, if you're interested in learning more about destinations and VCI best practices based off where and how you're shipping your parts, type that in the box to Ryan, and he will connect you with your ARMOR sales rep who'll be able to give you more information about that. So let's focus on parts right now. When you think about parts, I want you to think about your parts being apples in a bin. Throughout this entire presentation, remember that rust is like rot on an apple, and one rotten apple can ruin the whole bunch. So during a shutdown, if possible, we want to make sure we clean those parts. We do have Metal Rescue Rust Remover Bath that can be used to clean rust, but this slide is to also remind you, you need to have all contamination removed if possible. Try and remove grease and dirt off of those parts. If you have time and you can during a shutdown get your parts cleaned, that's best practice. But if you don't, you still want to cover those parts with some form of VCI. And as a reminder, VCI is a rust prevention. So it will not it will not remove rust, but it will stop new rust from forming. So best practice during a shutdown, if possible, clean those parts. Now, for parts of the shutdown, you might be taking parts out of the typical process, and there are a few things to keep in mind. Liquids that you're using during a process, as you know, they require proper titration. So if you are unsure about the metal part you are taking out of process during shutdown and the titration or pH level of your cleaning solutions, use VCI instead. So use a product like Dry Coat Rust Preventative instead of trying to clean that part. Throughout this webinar, you're going to hear me say good, better, best practice during a shutdown. So our suggestion for best practice is if you have it on hand, spray all of your parts with Dry Coat Rust Preventative spray, and then also wrap them with VCI wrap or poly. Again, best practice is to completely clean those parts, but if you're unsure of the titration of liquid, then it is better to cover with VCI wrap versus doing nothing whatsoever to those parts. So when we talk about VCI best practice within the shipping area, it's great to know this in this moment that we're in, possibly during a shutdown, but these action items are something that you want to use all of the time when you're packaging and shipping. You want to make sure when you're packaging and shipping your parts that you clean your work area, that you have no contaminants, that you avoid a temperature variance, you really keep those dock doors closed, don't store those products outside, and always use gloves. Now, when you are shipping parts or you're putting parts into a shutdown, you would have to have those parts usually on some type of packaging material. So we want to talk with you today about making sure you're careful using wood crates and pallets, interior dividers, corrugated, or cardboard. So when we talk about the proper use of VCI, we want to make sure that VCI is in between these items shown on your screen and your metal part. And why is that? And I find this so interesting. That's because wood crates and pallets are both acidic and moisture bearing. And for those of us who know rust, we know that that can add to rust on your parts. So the same is true for that corrugated cardboard and divider. Your best practice is to always remember to put your VCI next to your metal part and not on the outside of your pallet or cardboard boxes. And when we get into the part of this webinar where we go through applications, you will see that. Another example is just making sure if you lay those parts on corrugated that you cover that piece of corrugated with ARMOR VCI. Another best practice during your shutdown, and again, this goes to good, better, best, is to close that ARMOR VCI. So you can use a cable tie, and then if you look underneath that, you can see where you've had time to heat seal a bag. You can staple, you can use the zip if you have zip bags, you can tape, or you can take that bag and just fold it over underneath itself. So here's some examples of good taping methods and good packaging material. I want you to look at this picture of this gentleman wrapping these parts. If you look down by his foot, you'll notice first best practice that he has is that he has the VCI next to the part. It's not on the outside of the pallet or outside of the box. And then if you look up at the top, you can see that he's taping the VCI closed because he's making an enclosed space for the VCI molecules to leave the carrier and adhere to the metal part. And he's using what we call an H covering, which is just the style of how he's taping to try and make the tape the most secure on the top of that package. Now, this is a slide that I mentioned that we won't talk too much in today, which is destination. Just wanted to point it out because all of these items, whether it's domestic or exported, whether you're shipping time in transit or you're storing time at a destination varies, your ARMOR sales rep can work with you to make sure you have the correct amount and type of VCI in order to prevent rust on your part. So let's get into what we really all want to see today, which are some application examples. Because I think when we see these application examples, then we can apply them back to our own parts that we're protecting during a shutdown or during any type of storage. So this first picture here, you can see parts in a VCI bag. In order to give these parts a little extra VCI protection, the customers decided to also include VCI wrap, or that's the VCI paper, distributed about 12 inches between each part. So you think the bag, and then you have some parts thrown in, about 12 inches later, they have paper thrown in, and then they have parts thrown in, and then they close the bag up at the top. And it's a simple way that you can keep those parts safe during shutdown. The next three applications, and we'll look at each of these pictures blown up, are ARMOR poly applications. Just as a reminder, I keep saying ARMOR poly and ARMOR wrap. The poly is the poly bags you'll see that are blue, or the poly stretch film, and ARMOR wrap is the paper. So taking a look at this picture, what we have right here are rocking systems of door panels. They're lined up nicely, kind of stacked like dominoes, as you can see in the picture. In this application, we used ARMOR stretch wrap around the parts. This is something that you could do during your shutdown to create an enclosed airspace for the VCI. Remember in the beginning I mentioned that you need a VCI carrier and then you need an enclosed space. So they're taking the stretch wrap, they're wrapping it around the part, the stretch film is the carrier, and then it's creating that enclosed space. Another example of a best practice of using VCI are these engine blocks that are on a rack. Now, if you look closely at the picture, you can see that the bags are tied at the top. So the part itself is fully enclosed in the VCI, and then it's set into the rack. They've done this per engine block versus trying to wrap all of them together, and it's just best practice. Now, if you look at this application, this is another great use of VCI best practice. If you look at the very bottom of the picture, you can notice that the poly bag is on the inside of the cardboard box. And then I also want to point out in this picture two areas that you might not know could be typical causers of rust. First, in this picture, if you look closely at the metal, there are two dissimilar metals stamped together. Without getting too technical today, we do know that different metals with different energy levels next to each other are more likely to cause galvanic corrosion. So just another way of saying, if you've got stamped parts, these could be easily become your rotten apples or the rotten apple in your bunch. And another place that you want to keep a close eye on, especially during a shutdown, is if you have any holes in any of your metal parts. So if you look at that picture right in about the middle of the screen, you'll see some of those holes. If for some reason during a shutdown any of that primer wasn't completely sealed, that's another spot that can be the bad apple of the bunch or the starter of the rust. So when you have stamped metal or metal with a lot of opening in it, put that into your VCI bag, and then obviously for the picture they've left it open, but the next step would be to close it and put that H-seal tape. Now you got to look pretty closely at this slide. What you see on your screen right now are returnable trays. And at first you're like, perfect, they have done it exactly right. They have the packaging, the VCI, right next to the returnable tray. But if you look right through it, you will notice another best practice. In returnable trays, all of those handholds lined up together make what we call in the industry a chimney effect in packaging. And what I mean by that is we know for VCI that, and we know for rust, that the more humid the area and the more condensation, the more rust you are going to have. And on the outside of the packaging, it's pretty easy to tell. If we're in a more humid area, more rust. But sometimes we forget about that on the inside of the packaging, we can create an environment that causes air temperature to move up and down. So imagine air moving up and down in between those handholds, and then that's creating condensation and rust inside your packaging. So one of the easiest ways and best practice is if you have returnable trays or any parts that line up together that create what would look like a chimney, that you either line a piece of ARMOR VCI paper in there or take some ARMOR VCI paper and just shove it down into those handholds. And that will help you keep from having condensation and rust inside the packaging during a shutdown or storage. So the next application that we want to show you today is if you have any cylinder tubes. The interesting fact about cylinder tubes is that during the stretching and shaping of that metal that makes the part cylinder, it produces a lot of exposed grain boundaries. And grain boundaries are a place that rust likes to happen. Or if you think of that bad apple, it's a place where rust wants to start. And that shape, cylinder tubes, has more of a propensity to flash rust than other shapes of the same exact metal. So if you look at this picture, again, they have their ARMOR poly next to their parts. And then they have ARMOR wrap in layers. But then if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, they also have, you can see these white packets. And you have two choices there. You have desiccant, or you can look at ARMOR Smarty Packs, which are a combination of VCI and desiccant. If you have never heard of an ARMOR Smarty Pack before, I would say go to the comment section right now, or the question section, and write to Ryan and say, hey, send me some information. What is this Smarty Pack? And he will connect you with your ARMOR sales rep, and he'll connect you with information on the Smarty Pack. Not only are these Smarty Packs great for shutdown storage, but Smarty Packs and desiccant, as many of us know, also work when parts are coming off the line that are still wet. Not ideal, but you know that they're still going to be wet when you're packaging them. And a desiccant can absorb that moisture, while the VCI can then protect that part from rusting. So again, cylinder, more common to rust than other shapes. So in this application, they've used three items. They've used ARMOR VCI poly, they've used paper, and they've used Smarty Packs. So we're going to talk next about some ARMOR wrap applications during a shutdown. So the first, you can see this gentleman right here. He is wrapping a centrally needed part. So parts are expensive. And as I said in the beginning, sometimes it is just better, good, better, best. And it is always better to do something, even if you're just wrapping and taping ARMOR wrap around a part, than doing nothing, especially during a shutdown or, as you could be in, an emergency shutdown. Here's another example of a customer who's most likely didn't plan to leave the parts in this bin. We know that because if you look at the bin, so if you look at that 2921, you can see that that is a rusty bin. So most likely those parts are in some part of the process. This was not the bin that the expectation was they would be stored in here. So the customer then decided, well, we have to do something because it's always better to do something than nothing. They took ARMOR wrap on top of that bin and just covered those rusty parts. As I said in the beginning, ARMOR wrap is not going to remove the rust, but VCI and ARMOR wrap will prevent new rust from forming, especially if you have parts that you didn't expect to be leaving in a bin. Here is another quick and easy fix for metal that's in process. While it's a lot of paper, it is a very easy fix to take that paper and roll it out across that metal that's in process, whether that's parts that are waiting to move to the next part of the line or whether that's the machinery itself that's metal. And we've also found this picture, and this was not from a shutdown. This is actually just a choice to use Armor Wrap instead of Armor Poly. So you might be asking me, well, why would someone use Armor Wrap instead of Armor Poly in a process? And there's two good reasons in this customer chose to use Armor Wrap. The first is because we know that they were using CNC machinery. They wanted to make sure that they didn't have moisture on the parts that were being moved. So they didn't want to put those parts into an Armor Poly bag and close it up. And then the second benefit, especially during a shutdown, and when you don't have time to measure and have correct sizing for a poly bag, is that paper is shapeable. So they could take the paper and they could mold it to the correct fit and tape it down on the parts that they want to protect during process. So we've talked about Armor Wrap and we've talked about Armor Poly, but we also have two other items I want to make sure we cover during a shutdown for rust prevention. And that is a Armor Smarty Pack and Armor Dry Coat. So this is a gentleman who is using Armor Dry Coat, which is a liquid form of VCI protection. And during a shutdown, you can use Dry Coat, which dries to the touch in 30 minutes, does not leave any sticky residue, and is not an oily RP on parts that are in process in your plant that you're just going to have to leave, or the machinery itself. And then we have the Armor Smarty Pack. So if you have parts that are being shipped or stored that are in a tray, you have the Armor Smarty Pack, which I had mentioned is a combination of both Armor VCI. So the VCI is still coming out of the carrier. It's still protecting those parts from rusting. But in addition, hence the name the Smarty Pack, it also has desiccant. So it can absorb moisture from the air. So we see this used in storage, but also great for using during a shutdown when you just can't move those parts. You can put your Armor Smarty Pack inside the trays. So we've talked about some applications for using the Armor Wrap, Poly, and Smarty Packs. But we also want to make sure during this time of storage, you know how to use Stock and Ready and how that can help you. So as mentioned, VCI comes in many different forms: paper, poly, stretch, emitters, liquid. We have over 140 items on the Armor Stock and Ready program. And what you need to know during a shutdown is those items are in stock at Armor and ready to ship with no order minimums. And they are, if you place the order by 1 p.m., those items will leave and be on their way to you by the next business day. We've also made the pricing straightforward. We have your OEM container guides. If you are interested in hearing what products we have on Stock and Ready because you need them now, or if you're interested in hearing pricing, type that in the question box to Ryan. We'll make sure we connect you with your Armor sales rep so we can get that information out to you. Now, we know for many of us who are working from home right now, this is the time to go on and look at all the products, because you'll be able to look at the products you need for a current shutdown, and then you can also start planning for future summer shutdowns or just your typical packaging and shipping needs. So take a look at the Armor website. And I have to say, and I know I'm a little biased to it, take a look at the Armor corporate video. Hands down, to me, one of the best corporate videos that I have seen. So I mentioned today high levels of different best practices during a shutdown and what you should look for and how VCI can help during this. But the real experts are these individuals on the screen. These are your Armor sales reps, and we also have sales consultants. They will walk you through your specific rust needs during a shutdown. So connect with them. If you don't see your state with a picture on there, it doesn't mean that we don't have someone who's covering it. And also, if you look at the right-hand side of the bottom of your screen, ARMOR has international coverage as well. We have 25 different partners throughout the world in different countries. And so Fernando would be able to connect with you both domestically and internationally. So I have left the last few minutes of today open really for questions, because we know that this is a time that you might have specific questions related to specific shutdowns going on in the world right now, and we want you to ask those. So I'm going to turn this over to Ryan to see if there are any questions, and then just to kind of give you an update of where we are during the shutdown.
Thanks, Kristen. We received a number of good questions throughout the webinar, and I was able to answer most of them, but for everybody that asked a question during the webinar, we'll reach out to you afterwards just to make sure that your question was fully answered and maybe to go more in depth if needed. Kristen mentioned the coronavirus, and the state of Michigan, which is where we're located, they just did a stay-at-home order for the next 3 weeks. ARMOR was deemed an essential business, and so we're still up and operational. Kristen, myself, and the rest of our team in the office are all at home, but we have a skeleton crew still producing product and shipping product as well. And so we're actually quite busy getting product out during some of these shutdowns for our customers. So please, we have quite a bit of inventory. We have over 140 different items in stock, and we're fully stocked to get out to you. We can ship out tomorrow to get your parts protected during a shutdown that you may be having during this time. So we're up and running. I don't see any other questions coming through, so I appreciate you taking the time to get on today.
Thank you, Ryan. And just to reiterate what Ryan said, we appreciate you spending the time with us during this webinar. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to ARMOR, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your afternoon.